All's quiet on the Western Front. So we're not in the trenches quite the same as yesterday, but we are still in the trench line. I think everybody has a fair amount of space. Try to make it work. We got 2 rows going on. Here's a question I want you to ask yourself. Ask yourself, answer to yourself, but then in a second you can turn to your shoulder partner and share with him as well. Question on the screen behind with me. Who do you need a truce with today? Who are you fighting and maybe you just don't need to keep that fight going anymore? Who do you need a truce with today? Big question, heavy question. Think to yourself for a second. And as you have that answer, if you feel comfortable, turn to your shoulder partner and share with them. Who do you need a truce with today? Hear about rivals. Maybe some close relationships. Maybe your frenemies. Frenemy, that's a new word for this year. I did not divide you into teams today, but by the virtue of how you sat, I want to consider this front row to be one army, one set of trenches. And since y'all sat in the back row, you are a different set of trenches. Obviously, there's the desks between you. So front row, turn around a little bit. Just turn in your seat. Turn and face them. Take your paper and show it to them. Take the paper and show it to them. Take the paper and show it to each other. Front row, tell them how ugly they are. Tell them how ugly they are. Talk some smack.
You're women.
Back row, tell them how weak they are. Tell them how weak sauce their family is. Tell them how weak sauce their family is. Can I get a yo mama joke? Tell them how bad they are at sports. Tell them how bad their country is.
No,
keep it up. Keep that smack talk up. Y'all not so good at the insult game. Keep going. I need to hear an ugly joke. I need to hear a fat joke. I need to hear a you're bad at sports joke.
College, stop.
Yeah, college. Stop being racist.
Hey, at least I can hear nothing.
Y'all had a job and
that's offensive to me. That's the point.
Now you gotta be like, at least I'm not white.
at least I'm not black.
Yeah.
Shots fired.
We're on the same team.
Recognize the tune?
What are you trying to do? White
Recognize the tune?
Hey, friendly fire will not be colored.
Do you recognize the tune?
No. Oh, it's Silent Night.
Orchard is fine.
You might not recognize the words because they are in Austrian. But I bet you recognize the tune. What song is this? Silent Night. Silent Night, Heilige Night. Silent Night, Holy Night in the original Austrian language. If you were on the Western trenches on Christmas Eve of 1914, this might be something you heard breaking the cold silence between no man's land. Because what happened on Christmas Eve of 1914 is one of the most amazing, almost too good to be true, hard to actually believe events in, I think, all of world history, certainly in the history of World War I. What happened on Christmas Eve of 1914? What happened on Christmas Eve of 1914 is that the two armies arrived at an informal armistice, a laying down of the arms or a truce. I asked you who you might need to have a truce with, and you came up with a bunch of different answers. I heard Appling County, Brantling County, my cousin, my frenemy. Right? You might need a truce with someone in your life. What happened on Christmas Eve of 1914 is that the two sides, us versus them, sides that have been shooting at each other days before, for months before, probably days before, just hours before, had been shooting at each other, arrived at an informal truce in recognition of a holiday that tends to unite us all. This is known as the Christmas Truce of 1914. I'm going to show you a video while I have you at this place, quiet, respectful, paying attention. I'm going to show you a video of what it might have felt like, what it might have looked like to be in the trenches on that night. I want you to let yourself go there, right? Look. Can you be there? Hear. Can you be there? You know, I can't quite get some smells to come through the screen, but I feel like I can almost smell the scene in front of me. So watch this video and think about what it might have been like to be in the trenches on Christmas Eve of 1914. What you saw was one of the realest renderings of what I think it might have been like to be in the trenches on that night. I'm going to give you the super brief version orally, right, from me. And then we're going to watch one more video that kind of grabs a whole lot of the details and I think will illuminate it to you as well. So this is not one of the mega points to be made in world history. This is not something that would traditionally show up on a test. I don't teach to a test. I teach a life. And I want to tell you about the Christmas Truce of 1914 because it's really changed my life. It's made me realize you can lay your arms down and quit fighting the war. The war can be over, and I might give that idea to you as well. What was on your papers here? I'm supposed to hate you. It is double-sided. I'm supposed to hate you too. Right? I didn't even tell you which side to hold up. That was the mutual attitude between these armies. Two nations that were generally Judeo-Christian in background. Right? It's one thing for armies of different religions to fight each other. Maybe we can even understand their differences if we come from like big different ideas. These two countries were generally Judeo-Christian in background. So what you really have is two Christian nations fighting each other, but they think that they're supposed to hate each other. They're told that the other team is the bad guy. So what they brought to the trenches was this belief. What happened in the Christmas Truce of 1914 is on Christmas Eve, across portions of the trench line. Now, I don't want you to think this happened across all 500 miles. There are stories of the fighting continuing, the bombing, the shooting, the shelling. But across many different segments of the trench line, soldiers arrived at informal truces, right? In agreement to live and let live, and let's just celebrate this holiday together. On Christmas Eve, as you saw in the movie, across different portions of the trench line, soldiers called out to each other across the trench lines, if the trench lines were close enough for shouting distance. There is a confirmed story of this silent night being sung in Austrian. The Germans, right, the belligerents, the Germans started to hang lights above the trench line, lighting candles, even raising a whole tree. The British, from the other side in this particular story, they didn't quite know if they were about to experience an attack, maybe like George Washington's attack on Christmas Eve, or the Germans really going to attack on the eve of this holiday. So the British, they kind of braced. What's coming next? Are they about to come over the top? Will we be sucking down gas here in just a few minutes? Instead, what they heard was, in its original Austrian language, Silent Night, Holy Night, Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, Silent Night, Holy Night. And not to be outdone, the British returned with Christmas carols of their own. Eventually, in this particular anecdote, the two sides harmonized Auld Lang Syne together. So you have these two belligerents, these two armies that have been shooting at each other, singing together and harmonizing in peace. For a lot of these soldiers, they genuinely expected the war to be over within a month or so. Right? The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was in July of 1914. These soldiers thought, we're going to go and have one big tell-all battle, and surely we'll be home by Christmas. Well, they found themselves in the trenches on Christmas, thinking about home, thinking about loved ones, maybe wondering why we're here in the first place. So they took the occasion to have this moment of peace. Christmas Eve was not the big truce. Some soldiers maybe crawled out into no man's land. There are individual stories of soldiers trading chocolates and cigarettes, not unlike you saw in the movie, right? They traded their goodies with each other, even secretly. So Christmas Eve was kind of that low-level truce, right? Individual soldiers meeting in the middle, ha ha ha. You know what they were surprised to find? They were surprised to find that each of them were human. Each of them thought they kind of had the same idea. I'm fighting for freedom. You're not fighting for freedom. I'm fighting for freedom. Isn't that crazy? They both thought they were fighting for freedom. Well, come the morning, December 25th, 1914, cool, crisp. A lot of soldiers write in their journals that there was a break in precipitation. There was a break in the rain. Instead, there was a freeze, which actually made the flooring of the trenches hard and easy to walk on instead of soft and mucky and muddy. So it's kind of a welcome break from the previous weather conditions. And on this morning, on Christmas Eve morning, or Christmas morning, 1914, across various portions of the trench line, in total, we know that about 100,000 soldiers participated in one of these local truces, one of these local armistices. So again, not the whole 500 miles of trench line, but many, many portions experienced this local trucing. And what happened generally was that one head would poke up, not quite sure if it would get shot at or not. When it didn't get shot at, the body followed, and very hesitantly, much like you saw in the video, very accurate description, soldiers meeting in the middle. Like, are we going to do this? Are we really going to do this? Let's have ourselves a Christmas day. Soldiers met in the middle. Sometimes it was the officers that negotiated the truce for the day. And what followed is something truly unbelievable. We start to see soldiers doing incredibly human things. One of the most iconic moments and photos that comes from this is British and German soldiers playing soccer, football, I don't know what I'm supposed to call it, playing soccer together. British and German soldiers playing soccer together. Man, if only we could have solved our differences with the soccer game instead of shooting at each other. Another small anecdote, I think this is on the smallest of stories, but I think it's the most human thing possible. A German soldier set up a haircutting station, and he offered haircuts to anyone who got in line. Didn't matter what country you came from, didn't matter the color of your skin, didn't matter which side you were fighting for. What a human thing, right? Everybody needs a haircut. He offered haircuts to anyone who got in line. Mostly, this trucing lasted just for the one day. Some soldiers used it for not trucing purposes. Some soldiers were scouting the enemy lines. Some soldiers were rebuilding their own lines. So there was definitely still war and war activities going on during this truce. But by and large, most of the soldiers really discovered that the other side was just as human as they were. I'll tell you one more little tiny story, and then I'll show the video that kind of peels it all back. One more little tiny story. Another activity they did during this time frame, soccer, haircutting, trading gifts, taking photos, is that it was kind of a moment to get the dead out of no man's land and bury them in a peaceful moment instead of wondering if you're going to get shot at. And in doing this, they also had joint memorial services, joint burial services. So the English who killed the Germans may have attended a German burial. The Germans who killed the English and the French may have attended an English or French burial ceremony. It's a recognition of how we're all in this human disaster together, and they attended each other's memorial services. Well, in one of these memorial services, a British man, and this man goes on to be a pretty prolific writer after the war, he observed the Germans making rudimentary, wooden crosses to go onto their graves, as grave markers. They broke down some boxes that had supplies in them. They made wooden crosses to go as grave markers. Well, on these wooden crosses, it says, "For the fatherland and for freedom." And he says to the Germans, "What do you mean for freedom? We are fighting for freedom. You started the war. We're fighting for freedom." And the German says, "Oh, Englishman, my comrade, we are fighting for freedom." They both thought that they were fighting for freedom. Additionally, on this wooden cross, it says, "Buried here, known only to God." And the Englishman says, "God is on our side." And the German says, "No, God is on our side." They genuinely believe they're both fighting for freedom. They genuinely believe that they were both right. So something I always wonder is, why didn't this truce last? Why wasn't this the final armistice? Why wasn't this the laying down of the arms that ended the war? Unfortunately, generals and officers, it's always officers messing things up, right? I'm an officer in the Army, and I'll tell you, it's always officers that are messing things up. The officers and the powers that be, the leaders of these countries, they didn't like this Christmas truce. They didn't like this laying down of arms. And long story short is that hostilities began, picked back up the following day. Some portions of the line kind of held out all the way till New Year's, a week-long truce, week-long armistice. For most portions of the line, literally, they concluded their truce, just like we shook hands in the beginning. Well, now we met in the middle, and officers fired their pistols into the air and walked away as if to say hostilities are back on. So the truce really was just this magical 24-hour moment in most portions of the trenches where the war was over. And I just really wonder why they wouldn't have let the war stay over. I'll explain one more picture here. This is a variety of pictures. You can see it got reported in the news. Christmas truce at the front. These are Germans and Frenchmen taking pictures together. Same thing here. And this moment is commemorated by a variety of statues. That's one of my favorites that I have a picture of, where it shows these soldiers shaking hands over the trench lines. There's a soccer ball there to commemorate the fact that soccer was one of the big activities they engaged in during this truce. Anyway, after both sides did the bombardment and the defense of the trench line, I lined them up for one more go-round. I told them we're out of water balloons, but I'm just going to let you use the squirt guns and have some fun. But I had one young lady. I handed her a soccer ball, and I said, I want you to go out there. I want you to peek your head above the trench line. I want you to walk to the middle, and I want you to offer a truce and sit and offer to play soccer, much like the Christmas Truce of 1914. And, well, you'll see what happens. That's the best you got? That's your smack talk?
I'm gonna be sick on Thanksgiving break.
Jim, no! Come on, no, don't do it!
Say that loud, but you won't.
Are you on pace?
Halt! Halt! Er ist nicht bewaffnet! Er ist nicht bewaffnet! Nein! Jim! Otto, nein! Jim!
My name is Jim.
Mein Name ist Otto.
Pleased to meet you, Otto.
Freut mich.
Y'all want to play?
Danke.
Happy Christmas.
Frohe Weihnachten.
I'm not crying. You're crying. That was not planned. That was not coached. I only handed her the soccer ball and gave her the idea. The rest of it just happened. And I couldn't have imagined a more perfect ending to our trench warfare simulation than to also have a bit of a Christmas Truce of 1914 part of our simulation as well. Well, good morning, friends. And I have to say that I feel quite unqualified to be up here today. Not unworthy or incapable, but unqualified. And I'm grateful for this opportunity from Brooks, and even more so grateful for a Jesus who doesn't care about the labels that we put on ourselves. When Brooks was lining up this collection of messages, I hesitantly, and more on hesitantly later, I hesitantly volunteered to share my testimony, and he suggested that I do it on this date, as it is the Sunday closest to Veterans Day. Veterans Day, of course, is our country's acknowledgement of military service of anyone who has ever honorably served in a military uniform. And while it is cool that Applebee's and Chili's and Red Robin and all the other places that we don't have here in Alma offer a round of freebies to military ID card holders on this day, it is far more valuable the gestures that are genuine and the heartfelt thanks from people, not corporations, people that you actually know. And I want to return my thanks to this community for the outpouring of gratitude in a variety of ways on Thursday. I want to acknowledge Kevin and his 6 years of service in the United States Air Force. We got a strong foundation of veteran service in the church here, and that is pretty cool for our small little body here at New City. You know how we can know that we're doing something right around here? I think it's because we're raising up children in the way they should go. And I want to say a big thank you to Azalee, who's not still in the room, and she is, and Sophie. They're sitting right next to each other. I was looking at your parents. Big thank you to Azalee and Sophie for their performances at the elementary school on Thursday. Sophie recited an essay, and Azalee was part of a class singing a song to the Room of Veterans at the Veterans Day breakfast. So ladies, thank you. These young ladies were confident and joyful as they sang and they recited to a room full of veterans and their families, and it was really cool to see New City kids in action like that. So girls are really proud of you. And what kind of a high school history teacher would I be if I didn't acknowledge the history of Veterans Day really quickly? As I would guess most of you are aware, this country and most of the world recognized Veterans Day this Thursday, November 11th. Now, why was it on a Thursday? Wouldn't it make more sense to observe it on a weekend or at least a Friday or Monday so that federal employees could have a well-timed day off, well-timed long weekend? While that made more sense for a day off of work, it would certainly not make more sense for the reason of the occasion. Veterans Day, as we know it today, was established in 1954 by President Eisenhower, and the reason that it is held on November 11th every year is because in the year 1918, at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns finally went silent on the conflict known as the Great War, or even more scandalously, the war to end all wars. 11th hour, that's 11 a.m., 11th day, 11th month, that's November. 11 a.m., November 11th, 1918, the guns went silent. Now, by the very nature of us knowing it as World War I, we can probably infer that there is another that follows, that in fact it was not the war to end all wars. We, of course, have the benefit of time and history books, and we know that the world goes on to fight another World War II, and unfortunately, countless other number of smaller wars across history. But at the time, and you have to try to understand and put yourself there, the world genuinely believed that they were embroiled in the war to end all wars. President Woodrow Wilson genuinely believed that he had a peace plan proposal that would bring about a lasting peace for the rest of time in history. Wilson proposed to the world 14 simple points, to achieve a lasting peace. Follow these and there will be peace on earth for the rest of time, was his thinking. He would have made a good Baptist preacher. That's a long sermon. Usually we settle for 4 points, especially if they all start with the same letter. Actually, he was a devout Presbyterian. His father was a Presbyterian minister, so maybe the 14 points, maybe that's why the Presbyterians are never at the front of the buffet line after church. I digress. When the guns fell silent on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, a full-on peace treaty had not yet been negotiated and agreed upon, and that's another anecdote for another day, but this hour marked the agreed-upon armistice. An armistice is a laying down of the arms, a ceasefire, a ceasing of hostilities. November 11th was originally observed in this country as Armistice Day. Armistice Day eventually turned into Veterans Day as we had another crop of veterans to honor and to include in the observations. And November 11th is observed as Remembrance Day in many Commonwealth countries. England, Australia, New Zealand, France gets wrapped into their Remembrance Day. But guess what? This widely celebrated armistice is not even my favorite armistice of World War I. Not my favorite armistice story. How many armistices, plural, were there? Why didn't the first one stick? These are great questions, and I will go ahead and tell you. World War I began in July of 1914 and quickly devolved into the hellacious stalemate of trench warfare that is well known today. Trench warfare is fascinating and harrowing all at the same time, and those of you who have not yet passed through 9th grade may experience a tiny taste of trench warfare in my world history class someday. December of 1914 marked the 5-month mark of the war that many expected to last less than 1 month. Most of the soldiers on both sides truly expected to be home by Christmas, but they were not. December of 1914 found them facing each other, hunkered down along miles of man-made scars dug into the crust of the earth. Most of the trench lines were between 50 and 250 yards apart, although many were within that 50-yard mark, some as close as 7 yards apart, definitely shouting distance. As history goes, on Christmas Eve of 1914, soldiers on both sides of the nearly 500 miles of the Western Front trenches, stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss Alps, we're talking 500 miles of scars dug into the earth. These soldiers found themselves lonely and longing for home, longing for the normalcy of the Christmas holiday, longing for the peace on earth that Christmas was supposed to represent. Amidst the longing and the loneliness, soldiers from various parts of the front lines began to observe familiar Christmas traditions as best they could and in their own ways. One part of the German trench lines lit candles and placed them atop of the trenches. They even trimmed a tree and hoisted it above the trench line as well. British soldiers on the other side of the trench lines saw the lights and suspected a possible attack. On edge with guns pointed towards their adversaries and their Christmas trees, they began to hear an eerie sound coming from the direction of their enemies. Was this a signal for an imminent charge over the top? Was this the beginning of a coordinated attack? As they braced and waited, the words of their enemies were carried across the cold air, across the quiet space between the trench lines, and it soon became clear. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The Germans were singing, as it was written in the original Austrian language, Silent Night, Holy Night. Not to be outdone, the British soldiers on the other side of the German guns began to call out their own Christmas greetings to the Germans, literally wishing glad tidings and good cheer to their adversaries, to their mortal enemies. Before long, the two sides were harmonizing favorite Christmas songs and even Auld Lang Syne together. Now, to be clear, this was not the case across all 500 miles of the trenches, as the battle did rage on in some places. In fact, a journal entry, primary source, of a particular Bavarian, one Corporal Adolf Hitler, is quite critical of the holiday cheer. Corporal Hitler wrote, "Such a thing should not happen in wartime. Have you no German sense of honor at all?" So that is not to say that this holiday cheer was across all 500 miles of the trench lines. But there are many stories, confirmed by many journal entries, photographs, and even some official reports, of men at risk of their own lives crawling into the space between the trench lines known as no man's land and trading small gifts, chocolates, even cigarettes, as they might have if they were at home with their loved ones on Christmas Day. This was Christmas Eve of 1914. The next day, many sections of the trench line continued this informal and unofficial armistice on Christmas Day. At first, hesitantly, a head would pop above the trench line, and when it wasn't shot at, a body would follow. The most iconic of photos and stories of this day show soldiers from literally opposing armies who are at war with each other, playing football, they would have called it football, together on Christmas Day. Soldiers who had been shooting at each other for months previously, if not even just the day, maybe even hours before, were now talking to each other, playing with each other, and even trading gifts with each other. One of my favorite side stories is of a German soldier who set up a haircutting station and cut the hair of anyone who got in line, no matter what country he was from, no matter what side he was on. What a human thing to do. Everyone needs a haircut, right? Christmas haircuts. In all, it's estimated that over 100,000 men observed some form of a local, informal, unofficial armistice, a laying down of the arms, on Christmas Day, 1914. My single favorite primary source writing about the Christmas Truce of 1914 is a letter sent home from a British soldier named Henry Williamson. Williamson writes of an encounter that he had during one of these many unofficial armistices on Christmas Day, 1914. Among the soccer playing and the hair cutting, something else happened during this short truce period as well, and that was the burying of the dead, sometimes even joint memorial services for the fallen. Henry noticed some Germans who were riding on a series of makeshift wooden crosses that were going to be used as grave markers. These Germans were writing the words Für Vaterland und Freiheit, which means for the fatherland and freedom. Henry writes that he was perplexed, so he decided to strike up a conversation with the German soldiers. I said to a German, "Excuse me, but how can you be fighting for freedom? You started the war. We are fighting for freedom." The German said, "Excuse me, English comrade, but we are fighting for freedom of our country." Henry then pointed out that the grave marker also said, "Put here to rest in God, an unknown hero." The German said, "Oh yes, God is on our side." To which Henry replied, "But he is on our side." At this point, Henry writes, he realized that the Germans and the British had similar feelings about the war, both sides wanting to win, each thinking that they were exclusively right as to why they were fighting the war, each thinking that God was on their side alone. I have long been fascinated by the Christmas Truce of 1914, but I can't seem to get past this one unanswered question. Why didn't this armistice last? Or maybe the same question said differently, why did the fighting resume? I have often thought that the war could have been over if they would have let it be. My own testimony is one of war, not just the military part of my story, but the time that I actually went to war, but I mean a war of attitude and behavior, brokenness and sin. Just like the two sides of belligerents in World War I, both thinking that they were fighting for freedom, both thinking that they had God on their side, I too have lived and behaved with blinders on my eyes, insisting from a place of delusion, perhaps, that I am living rightly and on my own power, when of course that is not true, cannot be true. I've been at war with myself when I could have laid down my arms a long time ago.